Welcome to a new episode of Search Off the Record, where we have fun, sometimes talk about search, and get Gary in trouble. I'm the aforementioned Gary. I'm joined today by Lizzi, tech writer on the search team.
Hey, happy to be here.
And Martin, who is a search advocate on the search team, just like me.
Hi, everybody.
Today, we also have a special guest because John doesn't love us anymore, so he decided to skip this episode. But today we have David Price, and I'm super excited about this.
Hello.
Dave, why are you here and what are you doing at Google?
I am a Product Counsel, which is a lawyer who looks after legal compliance and legal issues for one or a few of Google's products. So we are legal generalists. We look at any and all legal issues that may affect our products, and we are product specialists. So my team and I are sort of the legal experts for the search team. And then kind of on the other side, we are the search experts for the rest of Google's legal and other similar teams.
That is fascinating. Side note, Dave is one of the more exciting people to work with at Google because his advices are always interesting and also very challenging sometimes. We worked together for quite a few years, and it's very, very fascinating to work with him. On the robots.txt topic, I want to touch upon a few things. Perhaps we can dive into its history, how is it relating to Google, but I'm also very, very, very interested in how or when did you first encounter robots.txt and how did you get to know about it?
That's a really good question. I have to admit, I don't know when I first heard about robots.txt because it's such an old and well-established thing that, you know, if you spent time on the web in the 90s even, which I did, which probably showing something about me, you heard about it. It was sort of the thing that was that sort of hidden Easter egg in a bunch of websites, that they had this file that you could go to, and sometimes it would have funny things that it would say to engineers. But for the most part, it was there to sort of manage the flow of automated accesses to the site. And I remember being a sort of young student at the time, looking at it and thinking, well, this is really interesting. Like, look at all these sites. Look at the flow of information that's happening. You have these cool things called search engines. They seem interesting. I wonder if you can make a career in those. And so, yeah, it was one piece of a really interesting puzzle that I'm very privileged all these years later to still get to work on.
That is fascinating. Does that also mean that you were a webmaster by any chance before joining Google, or?
Never in any kind of really serious way. I think like everybody who kind of grew up on the web during a certain period of time, I had a few web pages that I ran. I kind of knew how to run a web server, but I never really operated a website as anything more than sort of a very minor hobby.
But if you were operating a website, then basically you also dealt with robots and automated crawlers.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was interesting because I think at the time, even when I was getting started, there was a lot of focus on third-party hosting. I remember, I think in high school when I was a teenager, my school newspaper put up a website, which was sort of a brand new thing for school newspapers to be doing at the time. And I remember setting it up. I remember working with a friend of mine to get the hosting arranged. I assume we had a robots.txt file, but I have no memory of this at all.
Interesting. You haven't checked your robots.txt. Maybe.
I haven't checked the robots.txt file of my school paper. No.
That's shameful. I'm sorry.
I know. I'm really falling down on the job.
Another interesting bit from what you said was you specifically said something like automated clients. In our robots.txt documentation, we usually use the word crawler, but that also leads to the question, like, what does constitute a crawler, right?
It's a really good question, and it's one that I will get from time to time from folks who are working on different efforts at Google. And I think it's sort of something that people tend to look past because there's a lot of things that are just so obviously crawlers and so obviously things that are meant to be captured by robots.txt. That there is a sort of whole line of interesting questions as you kind of back off from the notion of having a fully automated system that runs a giant queue of URLs to crawl and runs 24/7 all the time. Kind of at the other extreme of things that happen on the web. When you open a web page in a browser, your browser is going to deploy some programmatic automation to access a bunch of different resources that are linked from the page that you loaded. So, you might load dozens of URLs as a result of one click on your web browser. And nobody thinks that's a robot. And it's quite obvious that that's sort of the opposite of a robot. It is a thing that is done at a user's request, sort of an obvious and logical outflow from what the user has decided manually to do. And so often when I get this question, I kind of try and think about that manual versus automated question. And is this something that is sort of aligned with something that a user is doing, where you have a person in the loop somewhere saying, yes, I want to initiate this thing. And then you want to make sure that you're not saying it's a person who's clicking start to the crawling program, but rather something where you expect to have kind of people in the loop, constantly using something and constantly saying, well, I'm interested in this page or that page, very, very much akin to a browser. And something that's not that, something that it sort of runs with full automation, that is going to be a robot. And if it operates at Google, then it definitely needs to obey robots.txt.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of our crawler setups. And for example, Googlebot, that would be the crawler. Like that's a completely automated system that just goes out and we give it a list of URLs and it will bring it back whatever it finds. And then we have in Search Console tester tools, for example, where the webmaster can log in and then they press a button and then still Googlebot or something that behaves as Googlebot would go out and fetch the page that the webmaster requested and bring it back from the webmaster's side. And that would probably be the kind of crawler that's more close to a browser.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think you can end up in a situation where, the thing you just described is something where you probably want to obey robots.txt because you're helping a webmaster test, can Google crawl this page? And if the answer is no, because it's roboted out, that's certainly something that the webmaster will want to know. But in principle, that's something where there's a human in the loop. And so you can imagine other situations where you have some kind of testing tool where Google would accept some kind of click from a webmaster or somebody and go out and fetch that content that was requested, and maybe not necessarily be limited by robots.txt in that situation because there's a person at the start of that process pushing a button to say, yeah, I want this thing.
I can see two things that are kind of blurry on the line where I actually don't know the answer to what if we should consider it a robot or not. So for instance, there's like the social media bots. So when the user posts a link to a page on social media, certain social media platforms are then making an automated request to that URL, which is not really something that I proactively as a user have requested. But the way that things show up, use these, I think it's called open graph tags that are fetched from these websites. And I'm not sure if these, let's call them robots, are actually following robots.txt directives or not. But I know that they call themselves bots. So, and it's not really something that I, as a user posting a link to a social network, necessarily intended to happen. It just happens because that's how this specific social network works. And then there's another thing that's actually a Google thing. What if I, as someone who has an e-commerce shop, am opting in to, say, Google Shopping, so that like Google Merchant Center can make requests, but then these requests happen somewhat outside of my control because I say, yeah, sure, you can do that, but I don't really request Google to do specific requests to my website. And then the robot, so to speak, so Google's product side has to figure that one out. And I think do they follow robots.txt? I guess they do. I don't know. Maybe not, because I, as a website owner, opted in already. Is that a robot?
It's a good question. I mean, this is all starting to sound like what we used to do in law school, where you throw out the obvious example and then you say, "Aha! Now, but what if we change this?" And now I'm having flashbacks to my professors in school. But yeah, to your first point, the sort of social media fetcher thing where you have a user who is posting a link to a web resource, and maybe that user isn't necessarily saying, yes, I definitely instruct you to go get that thing for whatever use I'm putting it to, but nevertheless there's some really good reason to go get it right then and there. Like maybe you need to produce a good pithy summary of that to put on your social media post, or maybe you need to scan it for, say, malware or other kinds of abuse. I think the way that would shake out is that that's something that's done once when a user sort of hits a button. And so the thing that I would probably say about that is not necessarily automated enough to be sort of hard and fast. You must check robots.txt, and if it says no, then you can't do that fetch, because what you're doing is you're doing something at the result of an immediate user action. And that's kind of the way I tend to think about these things. Is a user said, the user said, hey, I want to sort of in some way engage with this piece of content on the web. And it's kind of natural that you would want to look at that content on the web and understand what it is. And so the social media case, I think, is a good example where you might say that is not a robot in the classical sense. Now, maybe that then means that there should be some other level of control or some other set of questions if you're a webmaster and you say, hey, I don't want this fetch to happen. But the question of, is it a robot? I think the answer is probably not. And then sorry, Martin, you had another question and I've totally forgotten it.
That was the case where for a product, I, as the website owner, opt in to some program to consume content from my website, but I don't necessarily know the bits and pieces of, like, I don't have control over the requests made specifically, but in generally I agreed to have a program make requests to my website.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's something where we see different things kind of land in different ways. But I think the kind of high order bit here is robots.txt is a sort of scaled way to communicate permission to the web ecosystem at large to do crawling. I don't think anything would stop a webmaster from going out and saying, hey, for this particular specific integration that you and I are doing together, I am cool with you going and doing an automated access to my site, regardless of whatever my robots.txt says. It might be something where best practice is to adapt your robots file in that situation to account for whatever you've agreed to do, so that you have less sort of out of band permissions and denials that are not captured in the file. But that is maybe more of an engineering detail than anything else.
But I guess it still kind of consists of it fits our description of a robot, because it still is an automated system, and it is kind of outside of the control of a user or the webmaster because it does its thing as it needs to. So I guess it's still a robot, the second case that I described, but it's not really something that is falling under robots.txt territory.
So is a robot and a crawler the same thing? Because we've been talking about like client, crawler, and robot.
That's a really good question. My assumption is yes, that robots and crawlers are basically two words for the same thing, which is a program that acts automatically to access a bunch of web pages without human intervention. But I'm curious what y'all think about that.
I mean, we are using them interchangeably in public talks, which might be confusing, and we should settle with one. And in the RFC draft, the internet draft that we are going to talk about later, we are just using one word, I think, and that's crawler, because that's more specific. Because with a robot, you can also have, for example, an assistant robot that you specifically written for assistant, be that Siri or Alexa or our assistant. I forgot its name.
The Google Assistant. Google Assistant.
A Google Assistant. Okay, that's why I forgot its name. And robot is just a more loaded term, while crawler is very specific, in my opinion at least. And that's why...
Is robot like a umbrella term that could mean more things, and crawler is like a subset of that?
I mean, if you think about robots, then probably Googlebot is not the first thing that comes to your mind. It's probably something that, like, I don't know, like from the Hitchhiker Guides to Galaxy movie, the robot, depressed robot walking around, that's more likely to come to your mind than Googlebot.
Context. On this podcast, maybe Googlebot is the one.
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
But like I work a lot on robots.txt and on Googlebot, and yet when I hear robot, the first thing that comes to my mind is an actual robot versus Googlebot. And if I work with these things and I wouldn't say it confuses me, but crawlers are not the first thing that comes to my mind, then probably it's bad term and we should try not to use it.
It seems like also it could be just a phrasing thing, because if we want to say a crawler crawls, it feels like awkward and repetitive.
Right.
Whereas saying like a robot crawls is more natural. So I guess if you wanted to say a crawler does something, would you use a different verb like fetch or goes and finds or something else to just not sound repetitive when speaking or writing? So
on the dev side specifically, and now we are in the writing topic already, I don't like certain things that we use in the context of crawlers. One is the crawling, because it's a very descriptive term, which the crawler does not do. The crawler is downloading things from the internet or fetching. And I would like to see more specific words on the dev side, because there are things that Googlebot is not doing. Also not following links, for example, because Googlebot cannot follow links. It's just a fetch system. So, yeah.
Right. It seems like we give Googlebot maybe too much agency, that Googlebot is going off and doing things when really it's automated systems or other things that are instructing Googlebot to do something.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the thing to keep in mind is it depends on what you mean by Googlebot. Googlebot, I guess, is the thing that webmasters see downloading stuff from their sites. And then inside Google, there's that system, the set of fetches that Gary mentioned. But then also there's sort of the stuff that sits on top of that, that's orchestrating the crawl, that's prioritizing what do we fetch today versus what do we fetch an hour from now. And you could think of all of that together as the crawler if you wanted to. But I think the key point from kind of the question of what does robots.txt have to say is like, why is this happening? And is it happening because of automation or because of something else?
And that also touches upon the question of how robots.txt became important, because there were robots, especially in the beginning of the internet, which didn't necessarily behave well on the internet, and they were going rampant and ravaging sites. Perhaps that's also why robots.txt was born, basically giving people some sort of control over these rampant crawlers.
Why was that a problem, that the crawlers were doing whatever they wanted?
I think if you kind of think back to the mid-90s when all of this was getting off the ground, there was a lot more, or just the state of the technology then was reasonably limited bandwidth, reasonably limited server capacity. And so you could imagine that somebody with a computer in their dorm room might be able to impose a pretty significant load on a fairly well-known and prominent set of web services at the time. You didn't have the kind of galactic scale web service systems that you have today. And so I think the concern that one sort of ill-behaved script running on somebody's box under their desk could cause some serious damage to your ability to serve was, I think, a real concern at the time. And if that happened, multiple times and it was scaled across multiple different robots running all over the web, then I think you have, especially in that technological environment, a pretty significant problem.
Is that still a problem today?
Yeah, I think it could well be a problem. Just everybody's got higher scale now. The serving systems have higher scale, but then again, so do the hobbyists, many of whom are running their hobbyist systems on high-end cloud services, maybe even the same ones that the sites they're hitting are on.
Another aspect to the webmaster side is that in the beginning, in the 90s, bandwidth was extremely, extremely expensive. I remember the first site that I had, that was probably 96, 97, it was just like an HTML document with one image on it, and it was serving for a few days, probably not even a week, and I managed to incur like $50 worth of bandwidth traffic, and that was my allowance probably for like a year. So I was not very happy with it. And then when I was looking at the server logs, then it was back then a very popular search engine that was crawling that page repeatedly many times a minute for reasons that I could just not comprehend, because like it's a simple HTML page with no real information. It was just an image, yet the crawler was hitting it. I didn't know about robots.txt back then, but I would have loved to have something like that before I actually got that bill from my hosting company.
I think it's a really good point for a couple of reasons. One is you're kind of getting at this broader question of what is a well-behaved crawler. And sort of a necessary but not sufficient condition for that is that it obeys robots.txt. But you could imagine that if you had allowed that search engine's crawler to access you, then it would do that. Then it would do it again and again and again, and now you're paying $50. And it's something that I know the search team thinks a lot about is how do we ensure that we are giving good value for the bandwidth that we are pulling. We want to do a good job of going and getting data when it's likely to be useful, balancing between wanting to keep a up-to-date vision of what the web looks like right now versus not hammering everybody's website with $50 worth of traffic every day. And so that is a question of good behavior that kind of goes beyond the question of are you obeying robots.txt and goes into just more general standards of polite internet usage. But the nice thing about the robots.txt standard is that gives you the ability to say, I don't think this crawler is well behaved anymore. At least it's not well behaved to me. And so I'm going to say in a very lightweight way, this particular crawler should not access me anymore. So it provides a fair amount of control and autonomy for webmasters in that regard.
If you like internet archaeology, then there are some very, very old mailing lists where people are complaining about situations that we just described, and the original author or brainfather of robots.txt actually chimed in with a proposal, which was the robots.txt. And this was like way before Google, like years before Google, which is kind of fantastic somehow, because it just shows that like it was just something that Google decided to adopt to help webmasters versus us pushing something because we think this is going to be good.
Yeah, I think this is something that is important. Is sometimes I'll give talks inside Google on sort of the legal foundations of a search engine. And one of the things I tend to point out is that a lot of these concepts really do have their foundation in the web of the mid to late 1990s. Before Google was even a thing. Things like what is a search engine? What should a website expect with respect to the population of search engines that are on the web? There's a notion that, that dates back to the mid to late 90s, that if you put a website on the web, you should expect that search engines will go and access you if you have not used robots.txt to tell them not to do that. And that feature of the open web is something that you should expect. And that expectation in various ways has been looked at legally and seen to have legal effect in various ways as well.
In what way? Or can you say?
It's a concept. So the lawyer's name for the concept is implied consent. So the idea here is you have a website, you have some stuff on your website that you own, maybe you have a copyright in it, and there are various things that other participants on the web are going to do with that content that in one way or another triggers one of your exclusive rights under copyright. So the most basic one is users are going to go download your web page and associated resources, and they're going to make copies of that on their computer. It's going to sit in their browser cache and things like that. And the idea is that you never sort of wrote down a formal legal contract to say, yes, internet user so-and-so, I hereby license you to make the necessary copies of my web pages to render it in your browser. That's just inherent to the way the web works. And it's so sort of obviously inherent to the way the web works that you haven't seen a lot of litigation over it. You haven't seen people saying, well, wait a minute, all these web users are actually copyright infringers, because of course they're not. They're operating in a way that the webmaster expected and should have expected, and is sort of going to be deemed to have given a level of consent to. And I think the same is true with respect to the sort of basic aspects of search engines doing search engine-y things with content that they crawl.
Okay, this is fascinating. I love it. It might be a weird question, but how come robots.txt hasn't evolved in all these years? Because like if you think back, and I've seen those mailing lists or posts on those old mailing lists, and the basic structure of robots.txt was still, or it was the same thing that we have today.
Yeah, but why would you change a winning team? Like, it works. Don't fix what's not broken. It works, doesn't it?
Well, HTTP 0.9 also worked. It was not broken, but it became HTTP 1.
Yeah, and now it's HTTP 2, and we're on the brink
of
HTTP 3.
Also 3.
And that's because there are changes to the environment that, or like the situation or the systems, the networks, everything, that the way that we use it has changed so much that while it worked, it wasn't optimal. What would you say is not optimal in robots.txt right now? What is missing? What is not great?
So you're saying that it operates at such a basic level that it doesn't need evolution?
No, I'm not saying it doesn't need evolution. I'm just saying that the pressure of pain of using it is not great enough for something else to replace it or improve upon it. Or let me put it that way. The things it does, it seems to be doing well enough for people not to worry about it too much and kind of forget about it. So I don't know. Is there something that you think is missing or that needs to be changed based on how the internet has moved forward or evolved?
I honestly don't know. I just find it weird. Okay, tracking back, like I would be the first person at Google who would push back on changes to robots.txt. And I imagine that Paul Haar, one of our quality leads, and Dave would be the second and third. But I find it utterly weird that the protocol has been around for like 20 years or 20 something years, and it essentially hasn't changed. Like on the web, on the scale of the web, that doesn't happen often. So it's either like utterly good or I don't know.
I think one thing that kind of accounts for the success and longevity of the protocol is how sort of high level it is. It is very simple in what it says to do. It says, don't access these resources using a crawler. It doesn't try to do much more than that. And then one of the things that you can kind of get into if you start applying semantics to guidance like that maybe fits with a particular product offering that you may have. Like, let's say you say, well, I'm launching this new feature and I want to offer a bit maybe within robots.txt that says yes or no to some aspect of that feature. One of the problems is that might make sense with respect to version 1 of the feature, but features tend to evolve, and they tend to evolve in ways that you couldn't have predicted at the time you laid down that initial set of controls. And so one thing that we often sort of view with some caution is the question of, well, if we offer this control today, when we come back 6 or 7 years from now and we're on version 4 or 5 of the same feature, does that control still make sense? And part of the challenge there is that if you have declared a control years and years ago, then you are stuck with the interpretational problem of what does this opt-out mean in a world in which the technology has moved along so much. My legal colleagues who think about the U.S. Constitution, it's kind of a question of, are you an originalist? What was the original meaning of this opt-out? And you have the same struggle to figure out the right answer to that.
Has the original meaning of the robots.txt protocol changed?
If you ask the legal originalist, they would say that's the point, is it can't change. Is there was some notion of what robots.txt meant back in the day, which is, again, fairly simple. It hasn't changed that much because, to Martin's point, it hasn't needed to change very much. Here's what counts as a robot, which I think has kind of been worked out by consensus. Here's what you can tell a robot to do or not to do. And what it does or doesn't do is download content at a particular URL. And all of those things are so inherent to the way the web works. The notion of there's a particular URL and there's stuff at that URL that you might download, that the same concepts work equally well today.
I think one area where it could have evolved but didn't was indexing directive in robots.txt. And that was fairly interesting to me because even before joining Google, I knew that Google supports very specific indexing directive and serving directives in its robots.txt parser. But then when we started working on the parser, open sourcing the parser, then after consulting with many people at Google, we decided that we don't want to publicize that support, and in fact we want to remove that support, and that would have been an interesting evolution. I don't think I could have, I didn't want to support it myself, because I guess I would be an originalist. It would be like if the original author said that it's for controlling crawling, then it should control crawling. But then on the flip side, we index a very small number of URLs that are actually disallowed for crawling. It is on the grand scheme, it's an insignificant number of URLs, but we still index the URLs, not the content. And some people want to have control over that as well.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point about one of the reasons why adding a no index directive to robots.txt is exactly what you said. It's sort of, it adds a new concept that you have to think through and interpret. What's an index? What does it mean to index? What does it mean to not index? What counts as an index? And then as you said, one of the things that the setup that we currently have facilitates is a situation where search engines can come to know about particular pages on the web that are important, that the web says are important because there's a bunch of people linking to them, say, but the content of those pages is roboted out, and sometimes for good reason. There's a site that I use a fair bit, which is the repository of all of the big court judgments in the United Kingdom. It's called, I think, bailii.org, Bailii. And they have chosen to robot out the text of the court judgments for reasons that make sense and are reasonable to them. They want to, as I understand it, they want to make sure that if, say, one of these judgments has content in it that maybe shouldn't have been made public, that they can at least stop well-behaved search engines from going and getting that content. But sometimes these are really important documents. They may be sort of really socially meaningful and significant court decisions, and a bunch of people are linking to them. And so, how do you square that circle that there's this really important and widely linked to content that a bunch of people are going to be looking for, but there's a directive to us that says, don't download this from the webmaster? Probably the least worst outcome is the one that we've arrived at, which is we're not going to get the content from that page, but we're going to take our best guess at what is there. And if it's the right answer to a search query, show that to the user.
To me, this is also interesting because it's very hard to explain to people the distinction between crawling and indexing when it comes to robots.txt. And that always made me wonder whether we are doing a bad job at explaining this, or there's just like this very basic level perception that crawling is indexing. And I don't know, but in our docs, I think we got better at this. Like, we've been working with Lizzi on the robots docs for months, which is a topic on its own. Like, how do you push changes to our robots documentation? Because I don't know if our listeners got the sense, but we are passionate about this topic. Plus, it's a relatively sensitive topic. So pushing changes is not necessarily all that easy sometimes.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of nuance too, even with like particular word choice, like do not versus should not, like something shouldn't do something, but does that imply that it could still, or that you can do something versus flat out don't?
I think it's also something that maybe it's one of those things that looks different on the inside. So if you're working on the search team at Google, you kind of get a sense of how obviously I wouldn't claim to be an expert on any of this, but my job does give me kind of an overview about how all this works and how there is plumbing to go from, okay, we got this from the web. Okay, we feed it into our system that builds the index, and then it gets sort of from there pushed out to data centers and ready to be served to users. And each of those things is sort of a really significant step, often one that has a pretty significant team behind it working on it. And then if you're outside Google, what do you see? You see Googlebot goes and gets some stuff from your site, and then a little while later you see that stuff showing up in search results, and everything that happened in the middle is a black box.
Yeah, and that's what we are trying to make it more transparent, the way we can iterate on the robots.txt documentation. Like, I remember a few months ago we revamped our robots.txt documentation quite considerably, but it was structural change. Basically, we just rearranged the existing paragraphs in a more logical way. And for that, I think we haven't even checked in with you, Dave. But then if we wanted to change some of those normative keywords, like should, must, whatever, then that would be probably some of the things where we would run to you and ask for advice, whether we can do this or not, because those can be quite important.
Yeah, and this is a big part of what my team and I do for the search team, kind of at large. Like almost everything that the search team does that is public facing and significant and touches on some issue that might have a legal valence to it. That's kind of what my team and I are there for. Is Gary or someone like him will come to me and my team and say, "Hey, I propose to do this." And a lot of the time, the job of product counsel is to say, you could probably meet your aims by doing it in a slightly different way, or have you considered the risk of doing it in the way you proposed might be as follows? And that's sort of my day to day. That's what's in my inbox all day long. And so that's but I would definitely agree that sort of the things that we say to the web about what we are doing with robots.txt is definitely one of the more sensitive and important pieces of wording that we have out there that's really important to get as exactly right as we can.
We did change one of those. That was part of the structural change, was to try to make it more clear what that doc was about, and it's how we're interpreting robots.txt, that it's not just like a copy of the standard, it's how Google is interpreting it and what that means. But it was just a title change. That the doc, that's what it was before, but maybe it wasn't obvious enough without the rephrasing like at the beginning.
Yeah, the RFC the RFC draft, that was the other thing. That took a long time to get out. And I remember that we worked with someone who was back then working on the Googlebot team, plus Dave, plus Lizzi. Oh, and the original author as well. And we were sending a copy in circles to see if we can get something like this out. And the reason we wanted to do this was really just that it was so weird that after like 20-25 years, the robots.txt protocol was still just a de facto standard. Like it was not standardized. It was just like an agreed upon thing that some search engines followed in certain ways and others did not. And then webmasters had to make sense of all that mess.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that it's a little late. It does feel like an RFC or RFC style standard for robots.txt is maybe a quarter century later than you would have expected based on the way the web has tended to work. It's not like people went around using HTTP for 20 years and said, "Hey, maybe we should write down how this works."
But then we also went even further, and then we decided that we also want to open source our own parser so people see how we actually parse and match the rules in robots.txt files. That was also very exciting, and I don't know if we worked with you, but definitely Paul Haar was involved, and he was the one who approved an open source release, something that the search team doesn't do too often because, well, reasons. But that was also picked up really nicely, and people appreciated it, and some people also contributed in several languages like Java and I think Ruby. They just made new versions available in new languages, and I think Martin is also working on something exciting on that front.
Yep, we're bringing it to Node.js as well, or actually to TypeScript more specifically. Yeah.
Wait, Node.js. That means that no JavaScript?
Node.js. Don't make fun of my accent. How dare you? How dare you? Actually, I'm wondering about something. When I started implementing the robots.txt parser in Node.js, I noticed that the Java version, I think, doesn't use the exact same test suite as the C++ version. How do we make sure that all the different versions are behaving the same? I think like that. I basically take the codified C++ tests as the truth.
That's a fantastic question, and it has a very interesting answer. Last year, we hosted 2 interns, the Search open sourcing team, who were working explicitly on that, basically figuring out how we can test parsers against each other. Basically, the C++ one would be the source of truth, because that's what we use in production as well. And then we match the output of the C++ parser against the new language version, and then compare. And that meant that we had to, the whole thing has to be cross-language interpretation or execution, which is a very interesting thing to solve, to say the least. but our interns delivered and they shipped it right before they left, which was great. And then that's what we do nowadays. Like, for example, recently we had to fix a bug in our parser. It affected a very small number of sites, but we still had to fix it. And the way I tested it was actually matching the old C++ parser against the fixed version and see what it caused. Basically, we have certain test cases hard-coded in the tester, in the comparison tool, and it just does that. So for example, if you are going to launch a Node.js one, then you can probably make use of that tool. I can ping it to you once.
That is awesome. Yes, because we're getting there. Slowly but surely, we're getting there.
We also had a discussion recently, a few weeks ago, where we were sitting with Martin in front of a whiteboard and trying to reverse engineer the robots.txt parser because it was so low-level optimization that we could just not wrap our heads around it for like a couple hours. But that was really, really awesome and also exhausting. Surprisingly,
it was exhausting, but it was also awesome. And I just love that you can see the code hasn't just been written like by a team of people who like really made sure that everything is readable because they had to communicate to each other. It's probably mostly written by a very small number of people, and then other people have built upon it incrementally or something, right?
Yeah. I mean, so the whole robots.txt parser that started with Matt Cutts, who left Google by now, but he was one of the quality leads and web spam lead for the longest time. Or some people know him as the Google guy because he started communicating more on behalf of Google to webmasters or with webmasters. So he came up with the idea of like supporting robots.txt, and then Jeff Dean, for example, if you don't know him, Google his name. Like he was one of the first people who actually wrote the parser in like no time at all. And back then it was very basic. I think this was in 98 or 99. It was very basic, just a few lines. But then our index was also not that complicated. And then we could tell people that, well, you can just support this robots.txt protocol, and then you can restrict our crawler's access to your site however you wish. And since then, we've been building upon that, because some time after that, we also had the special operators coming in, like, for example, the star and $sign and the comments, for example, which are a nightmare to parse, but we had to have that. The sitemap key, that's also relatively new, as in like 15 years old versus 25, I guess. There were many people, you can still count it on your two hands how many. There were not that many people at Google who touched the parser, because it's such a basic building block of Google's infrastructure, and we don't make modifications to it. So all you had to do was optimize the living hell out of it, so it doesn't consume too much resources, and then just launch it and use it. I'm very happy that we could open source it, and I'm sure that at least some people appreciate it too.
Yeah, I was peripherally involved in the launch of the open source parser. I think I spoke to the interns who did a bunch of the implementation work, and I thought they did a really nice job. And I was really enthusiastic about it, because one of the things that I'm always kind of focused on in my role is, where can we be transparent to the webmaster community in ways that make sense and that are sort of in everybody's interests. And this, I think, is a great example of being super clear to the point of shipping some code and saying, hey, here's the code that parses robots.txt, is a really useful thing, because you can kind of see this is what we're doing on the inside. And, yes, ultimately, it's about the standard rather than a particular implementation of the standard. And Gary, as you mentioned, we found a bug, and the result of that is a change to the interpretation of a few sort of strangely configured robots.txt files. But at a high level, you can kind of see for yourself, if I apply this to my own robots.txt, what does it do? What is Google's view of my robots.txt? And you can see that for yourself using the code, I assume, that is the same or very similar to what's actually live in production.
It is actually the same thing. In production, we use the same thing. It's ported inside, and we are just using whatever we published. It was also interesting because since I published or pushed that bug fix, I was very curious how soon after Googlebot will pick it up, the change. And it was actually just like a day or two, and it was already in production, which was very surprising to me because sometimes these things take a while. If you had a chance to change something about robots.txt, then would there be anything that you wanted to change? Or to rephrase, what do you think the future of robots.txt is? Would it stay the same or...
Oh, that's a good question, because I don't know that those are the same question. Like what will the future be is maybe different from what would we have done or what should we have done a quarter century ago. I think the reality is that the standard is so well established that it's going to be hard to make kind of root and branch changes to the way it's implemented. I have to imagine that from an engineering standpoint, you might wish that it was deployed using maybe a more modern format or something like that. But the one that we have is pretty nice because it's fairly compact and human readable.
It doesn't have any bloat to it. It's just like rules and values, and that's it. I really like it for that.
It's easy to learn and relatively easy to master. But I mean, obviously, there's edge cases where you can construct really complicated rule conceptions and stuff. But I think, as I said, it has worked so well, and none of us at least is like, oh, we need to change this or we need to do this differently. That I don't think. I'm sure there's people out there who are like, this should be JSON or YAML or whatever. But as you say,
Oh, there are.
Of course there are.
The more recent thing that I've seen that people were trying to push for is to move robots.txt in the .well-known directory instead of leaving it in the root. And we were like, well, no, because no, this has been there for like 25 years. Why would we move it to well-known? And the second one was exactly that, like transforming it into a JSON object. And again, like why? Because
did they have answers to the why, or like have a compelling reason? I mean, why would you bring it up? I guess there must be something.
So they are trying to standardize like how we communicate or how websites communicate with robots, as in like crawlers. And the idea would be that like everyone is supplying robots with in JSON objects, which is still like human readable as well. But it just adds that one layer of complexity over the very simple rules that you can write in a robots.txt that doesn't make sense. Like we see people screw up robots.txt files every day. Now, spice that up with a little bit of JSON and you have even more people that screw up their robots.txt. So from our perspective, it just doesn't make sense to add more complexity when there's no benefit to it. Like everyone can just read just fine the text files. So why make it a JSON object? And that's for today. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this podcast and sharing their opinion and knowledge about robots.txt. This was the last episode of this year, and we will hopefully see you next year as well. Well, or hear you next. No, you are going to hear us next year. Bye.
See you next year.
Happy holidays.
Auf Wiedersehen.